November 21st, 2024, around 5 in the morning, that hour when a city hasn't fully woken up yet. And in Dnipro that morning, it was quiet. People there had long ago learned to distinguish threats by sound. That rattling, a Shahed drone. That whistle, a Caliber cruise missile. The heavy work of air defense, also familiar. But at 5 a.m. on November 21st, everything was different. First came a sound that didn't fit any of that experience. Not a whistle, not a buzz. It was a growing, low-frequency rumble so powerful that the air itself vibrated and window glass trembled, as if something impossibly heavy was descending on the city from the stratosphere. And then came what dozens of cameras captured. There were no familiar flashes in the sky. Instead, one after another, 6 blinding pillars of light driving almost vertically into the ground. These were warheads moving at Mach 10, about 3 kilometers per second. While you take a single breath, an object like that flies several kilometers. Sound simply can't keep up, so the city first felt a series of powerful underground tremors, and only afterward was it covered by that heavy roar from above. The strike hit the Rubezh plant, a legendary forge where for decades the most powerful Soviet missiles were built, including the R-36M2 Voyvoda, known in the West as the SS-18 Satan. There's a certain historical drama in this. A brand new system the world had never heard of struck the very cradle where Soviet missile power was born. Almost immediately a name appeared that the world now knows: Oreshnik, the Hazel. That same day, it became known. The launch came from the Kapustin Yar test range in Astrakhan Oblast, and the Pentagon confirmed an important detail. The United States received notification of the launch 30 minutes in advance through the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center. That notification is the key marker. Such channels are never used for ordinary attacks. They're reserved for things that belong to an entirely different category of global risk. But once the first dust settled over Dnipro, it became clear. This launch left behind far more questions than official answers. How did a missile officially banned and destroyed 40 years ago return in a new form? What's actually inside those warheads if they can vaporize reinforced concrete without a single gram of conventional explosive? And why was Rubezh, the very place that once forged the Soviet nuclear shield, completely defenseless against its own technological descendant? To understand Oreshnik, we have to look inside this hardware and untangle its strange family tree. We have to step back into the 1980s, an era when missiles once pushed the world to the brink, and when the rules were written that finally turned to dust on that November morning over Dnipro. Part 1. The Europe of Minutes. To understand why the word Oreshnik provoked such a reaction, you have to recognize one simple thing. It hit an old Soviet-era nerve. In the late 1970s and early 80s, Europe lived in what you could call the regime of minutes. That's not just a turn of phrase. It was almost a physical sensation, grounded in calculation, because people were literally counting how many minutes a missile would take to reach its target, and how many minutes politicians and command centers had to avoid a fatal mistake. Until the mid-70s, the tempo had been different. On the European front, the USSR fielded older missiles, large, mostly stationary, liquid-fueled, cumbersome, long fueling procedures, massive infrastructure. Their entire life cycle was visible to reconnaissance. Then the rules changed sharply. The SS-20 Pioneer arrived, a 2-stage, solid-fueled missile on a mobile chassis. Behind it stood the Moscow Institute of Thermal Technology and one of its key designers, Alexander Nadoradze. These were the people who, essentially, taught heavy missiles how to hide. For the military, the meaning was clear. The missile was no longer chained to a concrete pad. It could disappear into secret routes, hide in dense forests, slip under camouflage. And because the fuel was solid, it was ready to launch far faster than liquid-fueled systems. Moscow had its reasons. The USSR looked at Europe as a space where the US had vast infrastructure, plus the separate nuclear forces of Britain and France. It needed a tool that could cover the map quickly and massively. And here, the dangerous psychology of time kicks in. Flight time to European targets was estimated at 15 to 20 minutes. If you've never tried to imagine what 15 minutes means in a nuclear context, let me put it simply. It doesn't mean you have 15 minutes to make a calm decision. From that window, you subtract minutes for satellite detection, radar confirmation, signal transmission, human reaction. It evaporates almost instantly. NATO wasn't going to just watch. December 12th, 1979, in Brussels. NATO ministers made what would later be called the double-track decision. Either Moscow agrees to withdraw the new missiles through negotiation, or NATO modernizes its nuclear forces on Europe's borders. The plan was concrete. 108 Pershing II launchers and over 400 BGM-109G cruise missiles. And here's why the Pershings made the Kremlin feel that the timer had become dangerously short. The Pioneers gave Europe 15 minutes. The Pershing II cut that to 6 to 8 minutes. The difference isn't just in numbers. It's that those few minutes completely changed the mechanics of war. If 15 minutes gave a ghost of a chance to analyze and pick up a phone, 6 minutes is no longer time for dialogue. It's time for pure reflex. In military doctrine, this is called a decapitating strike. Moscow's fear wasn't that the missiles would explode in some field. The fear was that the first precise strike against command centers would turn the entire army into a body without a head. You can have thousands of missiles in silos. What good are they if communication is destroyed and the people who must give the order can't even reach a bunker? 8 tense years followed. By 1983, the situation was so tight that any accident could have been the last. That September, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov saw signals on his screen showing the U.S. had supposedly launched 5 ballistic missiles. He had minutes to decide. Somehow he understood it was a malfunction and refused to pass the alarm up the chain. The fact that the planet's fate hung on one man's composure tells you everything. A few weeks later came NATO's Able Archer exercise. Moscow seriously believed it might be cover for a real strike. Soviet nuclear forces went to full alert. We were one step from striking first, out of fear of missing those 6-minute Pershings. And it was at that peak of insanity, on December 8, 1987, that Gorbachev and Reagan signed the document meant to stop the timer forever. The INF Treaty. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. It was a kind of straitjacket for missiles. The treaty simply erased an entire class of weapons. Any ground-based ballistic or cruise missile with a range from 500 to 5,500 kilometers was now illegal. And the most interesting part began after signing. This wasn't a let's hide things in a warehouse deal. It was total physical destruction. By the summer of 1991, the sides had eliminated nearly 2,700 missiles. They weren't moved. They were blown up, cut apart, crushed under presses in front of former enemies. And the verification regime was something that today seems like fantasy, a system called continuous portal monitoring. American inspectors lived at the gates of the Votkinsk plant in Udmurtia. Soviet inspectors lived at the Hercules plant in Magna, Utah. They had giant X-ray installations to scan every container leaving the factories. This continued for 30 years. But there was one decision in that package that lives in Russian military memory as a symbol of strange, painful emptiness. The OTR 23. OK. SS-23. Spider in NATO classification was bundled into destruction. Formerly it shouldn't have been there at all. Its range was just under 500 kilometers below the treaty threshold. It was the brainchild of Sergei Nepobedomy, an extraordinarily fast battlefield missile. Its destruction is still called one of the most controversial moments of the treaty. Nepobedomy himself called it a crime against national defense, and resigned afterward. The logic was, yes, the Americans would eventually pull the Pershings, but they'd still have powerful aviation in Europe and submarines in the ocean. We'd be left with scorched earth across the entire 500 to 5,500 kilometer range. Russia voluntarily gave up its sharpest scalpel. This is when the vacuum started forming, a vacuum that would echo for decades. Part 2. The Ghost of Rubezh. By the 2000s, Russia found itself in a strange position. At the lower end, it had tactical systems like the future Iskander with short range. At the upper end, huge intercontinental missiles for targets in another hemisphere. But the middle, exactly the band you'd need to cover Europe, was missing. NATO bases hadn't moved. Distances hadn't shrunk, but the class of missile that could quickly and decisively reach them no longer existed. Around 2008, work began at the Moscow Institute of Thermal Technology on a project that would remain a ghost for years. RS-26 Rubezh. Direct generational continuity. Nadoradze's school passed into the hands of his student and successor, academician Yuri Solomonov, the father of the modern Russian nuclear triad. But to grasp Rubezh's engineering trick, you first need to look at its foundation, the RS-24 Yaz complex. Yaz is a three-stage giant, about 23 meters long, the height of an 8-story building. It weighs nearly 49 tons, most of which is high-energy solid fuel. Its body is carbon fiber composite, wound like a cocoon. Unlike the older Topol, which carried one warhead, Yars works as a high-precision distributor. Its nose cone contains a platform that, after reaching space, releases warheads one by one, each with its own trajectory and target. It also deploys decoys that look identical to real warheads on radar. Rubezh was an attempt to compress all that power into a more compact, sharper format. Engineers put Yars on a diet. Weight dropped to 36 tons. Length shrank significantly. The lighter missile got a more maneuverable, off-road chassis, easier to hide in forests. But Rubezh's main trick was its explosive launch. New engines and reduced weight let it complete its active boost phase, the phase satellites can see, several times faster than typical ICBMs. The problem was, its characteristics made it perfect for the 500 to 5,500 kilometer range, banned territory under INF. Legalizing the project required a sophisticated game that Western analysts would later call the Great Pretending. The whole intrigue centered on one number, 5,500 kilometers. If a missile flies 1 meter farther, it's intercontinental and legal. 1 meter shorter, it's intermediate range and must be destroyed. Rubezh's first launch in September 2011 ended in a crash, but in May 2012, a successful launch flew 5,800 kilometers and hit a target on the Kura range in Kamchatka. That single launch became Rubezh's legal passport. Russia announced, "Look at the telemetry. Over 5,500 kilometers. This is a full ICBM. It doesn't fall under the treaty." But right after that legalizing test, the biography took a sharp turn. In October, the same missile was launched again, this time from Kapustin Yar at the Sary-Shagan range. The distance, about 2,000 kilometers. The payload, notably, much heavier. These short-range tests, repeated in 2013 and 2015, completely confusing Western experts. The idea was simple and brilliant. With a lighter warhead, the missile flies almost 6,000 kilometers and counts as a legal strategic weapon. With heavier warheads or modern penetration aids, its range drops to 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers. The perfect tool for European targets. Formerly legal, the engineers had created a chameleon. It perfectly filled the void left by the Pioneer and Oka. So if Rubezh closed the gap so effectively, why did it disappear from the information field? By 2018, official documents began mentioning that procurement under the state armament program was frozen and resources redirected to other priorities, primarily the avant-garde hyperglide system. But it wasn't just about money. A political storm was raging around INF. The center of it was the secret cruise missile 9M729 from the Iskander-M complex, SSC-8 Screwdriver in NATO classification. The Americans insisted it flew 2,500 kilometers. Moscow held to 480 kilometers. In that atmosphere, Rubezh, whose very existence pointed at forbidden distances, was tucked away. Not scrapped, quietly archived for better times. Meanwhile, a new project began circulating in design circles under the code name Kedar. Cedar. Talked about not just as a Yars replacement, but as a next-generation system meant for combat duty around 2030. Maximally digital, autonomous, even harder to catch with satellite reconnaissance. Then, 2019 arrived. The decades-long INF confrontation hit boiling point. On August 2nd, the US officially withdrew from the treaty. There were two reasons. The first, 9M729, used as the official pretext. The second, far more important, China. Beijing was bound by no treaty, and was actively building thousands of intermediate-range missiles against which the U.S. had no answer in the Pacific. Burying the agreement freed both Washington's hands and everyone else's. Russia responded calmly but firmly. We won't deploy such missiles first, but if American systems appear in Europe or Asia, the answer will be immediate. Technically, the foundation was ready. The proven Yars platform, the Rubezh experience with range manipulation, likely Ketter's control systems too, though the precise genealogy of Oreshnik remains classified. The world saw the result on November 21, 2024. After the Yuzhmash strike, in his official address, Putin named the system Oreshnik. Part 3. Inside the hazel. So what did we actually see that night over Dnipro? Where did those unfamiliar flashes come from? Those short, blinding tracks heading almost straight down? Why was the reaction window for air defense so narrow? And where does the line run between a demonstration of conventional power and the potential to operate in a completely different, far more dangerous scenario? Let's start with the name, Oreshnik, the hazel. It sounds like a forest walk for mushrooms or berries, not a brand new strategic weapon system. That's by design. It's perfect for a broad audience and easier to hide secret indexes behind. But the metaphor works on two levels. First, stealth. A mobile complex dissolves into the landscape like a bush in dense thicket, invisible to satellites. Second, the principle of shell and nuts. The missile is just a sturdy launching cocoon. Inside is a cluster of warheads, hidden until the very end. The enemy doesn't know what's coming, plain metal or a nuclear charge. Almost immediately, Oreshnik was classified as a medium-range ballistic missile. Russian statements and American assessments converged on this. The word ballistic matters more than any loud epithet because it explains the physics. If a cruise missile is an airplane, it lives in the atmosphere, maneuvers, hides in terrain folds, sneaks to its target, then ballistics is a throw. A massive boost, an exit into near space, a steep return arc. In those final seconds, the fate of the object isn't decided by maneuvering cleverness, but by relentless mechanics and extreme speed. That trajectory creates the falling sky effect. Oreshnik's most likely relative, as Washington itself confirmed almost immediately, is the Rubezh project. American analysts essentially stamped RS-26 on the missile right after the November launch. This was the key clue. There's no official spec sheet, of course. But the parameters of Rubezh, recorded in CSIS databases and Reuters references, paint a picture. A 12-meter body, starting mass around 36 tons. Modern analytics on Oreshnik often cite up to 5,000 kilometers of practical range, slightly less than Rubezh's record 5,800, but the potential clearly exceeds any minimum number stated publicly. What changed dramatically? Payload. Where the base, Rubezh carried about 800 kilograms. Analyses of Oreshnik site numbers up to 1.5 tons of heavy payload. Different works describe it differently. Some mean the combined mass of 6 warheads plus sub-elements and penetration aids. Others mean the missile's throw weight. Either way, the increase fits a clear evolution. The engineers built a reinforced platform for a multi-warhead front section, turning a single launch into a full swarm. But the most resonant factor isn't weight, it's time and speed. According to data Reuters cited from Ukrainian sources, the launch to impact time was about 15 minutes. Terminal speed exceeded 13,000 kilometers per hour. That's deep hypersonic territory. Mach 10 to 11. So why did Earth see unfamiliar explosions and bright vertical tracks? The answer lies in high-temperature aerodynamics and plasma physics. When a warhead or sub-element enters the dense atmosphere at hypersonic speed, the air in front of it stops being just gas. Adiabatic compression occurs. The missile flies so fast that the air can't disperse in time. It compresses instantly into a powerful, dense layer. The compression is so violent it generates monstrous heat. Temperatures in the shock layer reach several thousand degrees. That's enough for oxygen and nitrogen molecules to dissociate and turn into an ionized, glowing envelope. What cameras captured wasn't a flash from detonating explosives. It was radiation from this high-temperature plasma envelope wrapping the incoming body. The tracks looked bright and almost silent because the main energy released was heat and light, while the elements themselves worked as kinetic penetrators. Sheer mass and speed gave them colossal energy. Motion alone turned the metal into destructive force, punching through reinforced concrete without chemical explosives. This plasma envelope plays another critical role. For radars and seeker heads, plasma creates an electromagnetic shielding effect, what's called radio frequency blackout. The ionized air layer scatters radar signals. Image clarity in the final seconds collapses for the defender. No magic invisibility, just brutal physics. The target exists in an extreme environment that physically blocks classic electronics at precisely the moment when there's no time left. Patriots and SAMP/T theoretically intercept ballistic targets, but here they hit hard limits on channel throughput. When you don't have one missile incoming but a group of hypersonic targets, defense becomes a problem of saturation. The system simply can't process that many signals and distribute interceptors in such a compressed time window. According to detailed reconstructions in the NSDC report, Oreshnik used a 6x6 scheme. 6 main warheads, each releasing 6 sub-elements during separation. Total, up to 36 independent incoming objects. Part of them, decoys, mass, and geometry, matched to real warheads glowing identically in the plasma cocoon. The defender's nightmare. The screen fills with a swarm. Seconds to discriminate real targets. Even if interception is theoretically possible, the defense burns expensive interceptors on dummies. The trajectory looked almost vertical because of geometry. Launch point, likely Kapistan Yar in Astrakhan. Target, Dnipro. Roughly 800 kilometers. For a missile class capable of 5,000 plus kilometers, that's point-blank range. Like firing a sniper rifle at close quarters. A standard economical trajectory would have entered at a shallow angle. What was almost certainly used instead is a lofted trajectory. The missile deliberately tossed onto a very high arc. Excess energy spent climbing. The warheads return not glancing but plunging almost straight down. Maximum penetration. And exactly the visual the cameras recorded. Vertical impacts following one another. One more thing struck observers. Damage at Mach looked relatively localized. Why? The answer, supported by Ukrainian sources cited by Reuters, Oreshnik's warheads may have been inert, no explosive inside. This fits the logic of a demonstration test perfectly. Hypersonic kinetics is self-sufficient destruction. Impact energy grows with the square of velocity. A 20 to 30 kilogram subelement entering at 3.5 kilometers per second carries hundreds of megajoules. Metal becomes a kinetic hammer. No fireball, no familiar blast wave. It punches through. Reinforced concrete shatters under monstrous pressure and deep deformation. And here is the strategic point hiding behind all this. Almost every intermediate-range ballistic system is designed to be nuclear capable. A satellite or radar operator can't look under the shroud at launch. The same platform in one case can carry inert kinetic elements. In another, full nuclear warheads. That's why the seemingly bureaucratic detail, Russia notifying Washington 30 minutes ahead via the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, is actually the main safety valve against global catastrophe. In wartime, any ballistic launch looks to early warning systems like the start of nuclear war. To prevent the other side from reading the signal as the worst-case scenario, you have to remove ambiguity in advance. Part 4. The Belarusian Gambit. On December 30th, 2025, Oreshnik stopped being a topic for forecasts and became a specific point on the map. That day, the Russian Ministry of Defense published a video, Snowy Forest, Camouflage Nets, the first mobile division of Oreshnik officially entering combat duty in Belarus. The footage was deliberately routine, the commander accepting reports, launchers taking positions, not a "let me surprise you" moment, more a fixation of a new reality. 3 dates led here. December the 12th, 2024, a new security guarantee treaty signed in Minsk. December 17th, 2025, Putin set the hard deadline, deployment by year-end. December 22nd, Lukashenko mentioned a figure of up to 10 launchers. That's not a one-time gesture. That's a full operational district with constant rotation. From that moment, attention shifted from the missile to its launch location, because in nuclear deterrence, geography defines strategy. While officials stayed silent on coordinates, experts from the Middlebury Institute and CNA analyzed satellite imagery and pointed to the Krychev 6 abandoned airfield in Mogilev region. The location fits the logic of military compromise perfectly. Formally, the complex stands in Belarus. Practically, it's just 5 kilometers from the Russian border. Those 5 kilometers are the most important detail in the whole arrangement. Physically, the distance changes nothing. A missile with thousands of kilometers of range doesn't become more effective if you nudge it slightly west. The point is pure pragmatism. The base lets Russian forces keep full control of logistics and communications. Moving warheads from Russian storage becomes a short, safe drive. And for NATO, it creates a political dilemma. A hypothetical strike on the base means an attack on Belarus, legally much harder to justify than striking Russia itself. But behind the political maneuver hides the more serious challenge, the complete collapse of old assumptions about time. At 3.5 kilometers per second, Warsaw is under target in 100 to 120 seconds after launch. The Polish air defense crews must not just hear the siren, but classify the target and attempt interception. At those dynamics, it borders on impossible. We're essentially repeating the 1980s mid-range missile crisis, but in accelerated mode. Then it took decades. Now it took weeks. The irony: Oreshnik and Krychev doesn't open any new targets. Russia could already reach those cities from Russian territory. This was a deliberate strategic move. Bring the threat onto the neighbor's doorstep. Make it physically palpable. Russia didn't just deploy a new missile. It moved the red line right up against the alliance's borders, stripping NATO of the comfort of distance. Part 5. The Western Answer. So if Russia moved its launchers so close that flight time became the deciding factor, what's the other side doing? Does NATO have anything comparable? Let's be clear. A direct copy of Oreshnik, a ballistic system with the same built-in ambiguity, the West doesn't currently have. But over the past year and a half, the US and Europe have surprisingly quickly rehabilitated the very concept of ground-based intermediate-range missiles. The idea was carefully avoided for 30 years while INF held. Now it's back on the table. The key date, July 10th, 2024, the NATO summit. The US and Germany issue a joint statement. Starting 2026, Washington will begin rotational deployment of long-range fires in Germany under the multi-domain task force. 3 systems are named in the text: SM-6, Tomahawk, and developing hypersonic weapons. The centerpiece is the Typhoon complex, officially called the mid-range capability. The trick is that the Americans didn't invent some exotic new missile from scratch. They took their most proven naval arsenal and put it on mobile wheels. Inside Typhoon, typically 2 very different threats. First, the famous Tomahawk, the long arm of American forces, subsonic but extremely long-ranged, over 1,600 kilometers, and as stealthy as possible. If Oreshnik is a vertical hammer trying to punch through defense with kinetics and physics, Tomahawk is a creeping mass threat that can take hours sneaking in at very low altitude, hiding in terrain folds. Based in Germany, it reaches enormous parts of European Russia. Second, the SM-6, Standard Missile 6. Originally, a naval air defense missile for intercepting aircraft and missiles at sea. They've now taught it to strike ground targets effectively. Unlike Tomahawk, SM-6 flies far faster on a quasi-ballistic trajectory. A very awkward target for any air defense. Speed plus maneuverability denying the enemy a clean intercept solution. When this naval arsenal moves to ordinary trucks, the entire strategy changes. A ship can be tracked. It's restricted to water. A mobile Typhoon can disappear into any forest or hangar, maintaining 5-minute launch readiness. In July 2025, Germany's Defense Minister Boris Pistorius confirmed Berlin had requested permission to purchase Typhoon complexes from the US. By October 2025, leaked figures pointed to a planned deal for 400 Tomahawks and 3 Typhoon launchers, about 1.4 billion euros total. Still unsigned, still plans. But the scale matters. Europe is no longer a passive spectator. The second element, hypersonic weapons. On April 24, 2025, the U.S. Congress officially confirmed the status of the long-range hypersonic weapon, Project Dark Eagle. Its range, according to USNI data, is about 2,775 kilometers, Some estimates reach 3,500 depending on profile. A hypersonic glide vehicle. Powerful booster lifts it high, then it separates and races to the target in dense atmosphere, constantly maneuvering. If Tomahawk is the ghost, Dark Eagle is the crowbar, breaking through any existing defense via massive kinetic energy and unpredictable trajectory. The third layer, the PRSM, Precision Strike Missile, the workhorse for distances previously banned. According to CRS reports, PRSM confidently crosses the 500-kilometer threshold. In summer 2025, it reached Milestone C, official start of serial production. The key feature, it launches from existing HIMARS and M270 systems that Europe already operates by the hundreds. 2 PRSMs fit in one cell where one ATACMS used to go. Firepower per unit doubles automatically. A version with a ramjet engine, SMET, is in testing, aiming for 1,000 plus kilometers. So the US is building a true European multi-layered cake. PRSM closes the near range, up to 1,000 kilometers. Typhoon with Tomahawks and SM-6 takes the middle, up to 2,500 kilometers. Dark Eagle becomes the precision deep strike tool, up to 3,000 kilometers. Europe's dilemma against this backdrop is sharp. Without its own long-range system, it stays dependent on the US or in permanent catch-up. So on July 11, 2024, France, Germany, Italy, and Poland signed a letter of intent on the European long-range strike approach, a ground-launched cruise missile with range above 500 kilometers. But by the end of 2025, the unified program fractured into 3 national projects. Germany and the UK took up deep precision strike. France began developing LCM, Land Cruise Missile, its own national project based on naval technology. Germany and Norway united around 3SM Turfing, a supersonic missile named after the mythical sword, prioritizing speed. This fracture isn't a technical hiccup. It's a symptom that European coordination moves too slowly while the window of vulnerability is open right now. As a result, the temporary American bridge, Typhoon, has stopped being temporary. It's the only real way to close the defensive gap for a full decade while Europeans argue over who'll be prime contractor on their own projects. A world without rear. If you compress all this into one sober formula, what you get is a collision not just of hardware, but of 2 different strategies of intimidation. The Russian approach, bet on vulnerability through speed and mass. Oreshnik is just the tip of the iceberg. Mobile Iskanders, hypersonic Kinzhals, Zircons. The general line is the same: create a physical crowbar that any existing air defense simply can't process. Strategy of qualitative superiority. Arrive so fast and so painfully that interception itself becomes an impossible math problem. The Western logic is different. Scalability and flexibility. Not one ideal missile, but a multi-layered cake from what's already on hand. Proven Tomahawks, fast SM-6s, hypersonic Dark Eagle on top. Not breaking the wall with one sledgehammer, creating a cloud of threats where anything can come out of any forest. One small detail closes the picture. On July 10th, 2024, 2 events happened that hardly seem coincidental. That day, the missile defense base in Polish Redzikowo was officially handed over to NATO Operational Command and declared mission ready. Years of construction, the main shield of Eastern Europe. And on that same day, the US and Germany announced they were bringing long-range missiles back to the continent. The irony is sharp. The very moment European defense architects finally cut the ribbon, it became clear that defense alone was no longer enough. Redzikowo essentially fixed the transition to a new era on its own opening day. European security is no longer trying to hide behind a perfect missile shield. It's a game of getting ahead. We've ended up in a world where geography no longer works as a buffer. The distance between Krychev and NATO command posts is no longer measured in kilometers. It's measured by the short interval between a signal appearing on a monitor and the final confirmation in a command center. The map is the same, but the concept of a deep, safe rear has been wiped from it.